This is a log flume. This is a bigger log flume. What about an even bigger log flume? In fact, there's something special about this one. It's not just big. It was the biggest log flume in the world, standing at around 130 feet tall, perfectly integrated into the mountainside. At least it used to be. This is what it looks like now. Rusted supports, moss-covered track, and a crumbling structure. Overgrown and swallowed up by the jungle. So, what happened? How does something like this die? Not far away from it is this. This is Wood Coaster. It's one of the longest wooden roller coasters on Earth, and for a time probably one of the best. It speeds through the jungle using its terrain perfectly, just like the log flume. But now nobody's riding it either. It, too, has been left to rot, standing but not operating, its train stationary and its lift hill silent. How could this possibly be? Well, this is OCT East Resort in Shenzhen, China. It's one of the largest theme park resorts in the world. While you may be familiar with massive theme park resorts like Disney World, Universal Orlando, maybe Cedar Point or Alton Towers, all of those pale in comparison to the size of OCT East. And I can all but guarantee you, none of those parks are even close to as interesting as this one. Once imagined as a world-class mountain city of entertainment, nature, and luxury, home to not just a colossal log flume and wood coaster, but a vast collection of parks, hotels, animal exhibits, and scenic trails, it has now faded into irrelevancy. This is the story of OCT East, one of the most ambitious resorts ever conceived. A massive theme park megaproject carved into the mountains of southern China, once destined for greatness, but now a forgotten relic, half abandoned, and slowly reclaimed by the jungle that surrounds it. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this video is a collaboration done by me and a like-minded creator who has been instrumental in this video's development. After you're done, I highly encourage you to check his t-shirt brand out and give him some love in my Discord server. Anyway, let's begin the story of OCT East. During the 1990s and early 2000s, China as a country experienced an enormous economic transformation. Entire cities were going up in what felt like overnight, rural towns were becoming urban centers, and millions of people were urbanizing, fueling the economy to look for job opportunities and better lives. The country was in the middle of one of the biggest urban transformations in human history. Along with that growth came the expansion of the Chinese middle class, with some money to spare to spend on leisure activities. All eyes soon centered on the leisure industry, which started to grow just as fast as the cities themselves were. People didn't just want to work, they wanted to be entertained. This primal need is what would eventually breed the most competitive entertainment market in the world, with golf courses, sports facilities, and nature spots recording record tourist numbers at the time. Soon companies dedicated themselves to just that, making sure people had fun, and whichever company did it best made all the money. One of those companies was Overseas Chinese Town Enterprises, or the OCT Group. They're a huge Chinese company established in 1985 that has since focused on various aspects of the leisure industry. A major player in the real estate and hotel industry, their main calling card starting in the mid-1990s soon shifted to theme parks. Along with Fantawild, OCT quickly rose to be one of the most prominent names in theme park development. In fact, according to the 2019 Themed Entertainment Association Theme Park Attendance Report, the last year pre-pandemic, the OCT Group ranked first out of Chinese companies in theme park attendance and third in the world, only behind Disney and Merlin. Their huge portfolio includes 17 theme parks in China, with a few more currently planned or under construction. Among these are the Happy Valley parks, which seem to be the most popular and well-known. But back in the 1990s and 2000s, they operated only a few theme parks, 3 to be exact, with Window of the World, Colorful World, and Happy Valley Shenzhen, with 2 more on the way. And because of the positive reception to their early parks and the fact that the Chinese theme park and leisure industry showed no signs of slowing down, the OCT Group knew that to compete they would have to plan something big, something that China hadn't seen before. The OCT Group had a vision for a spectacular sprawling resort nestled in the mountains outside Shenzhen, one of the fastest growing cities not just in China, but the world at the time. This wouldn't just be a theme park like their previous properties. It would be a fully fledged mega resort, almost city-like, with not just multiple theme parks, nature trails, and animal exhibits, but also a plethora of luxury hotels, museums, golf courses, and even more. In a time where leisure companies were competing with one another, this was built to blow all those other companies out of the water. The OCT Group had a dream, and that dream was a utopia. When OCT East Resort was announced in the early 2000s, it seemed almost too good to be true. But with the ridiculous amount that companies were pouring into their properties, it also seemed too real to fail. While the promise of a forest city built into the mountains was a wild idea, the OCT Group never showed any signs of reneging on that promise. So when construction broke ground for the mega resort on New Year's Eve of 2004, it seemed as if these wild dreams would come true. The resort cost 3.5 billion Chinese yen to build, or 800 million US dollars in today's money. A lot of this was paid by the government of Shenzhen, which was one of the main stakeholders in the park, choosing to bet on its success. This is similar to Energylandia, which has received enormous grants from the Polish government and the European Union in order to bring tourism to the area and benefit the wider local economy. In terms of how the cost of OCT East compares to how much other parks cost to build, the logistics are complicated, but as a general example, it's about as much as a full-scale regional park, think something like Parc Asterix or even a Phantasialand. Now, 800 million USD sounds like a lot, but when you take into account the scale of OCT East Resort, it's actually not that much. And there's one major reason for this that can also be tied back to the park's identity and overall mission. Above all else, above the theme parks and luxury living experience, OCT East Resort was marketed to be a place where man-made structures and nature came together. At its heart, it was an ecological resort. So instead of bulldozing land and building a theme park on top of it like most theme park developers do, OCT East was fully integrated into the nature surrounding it. The location and incorporation of the resort into that location led to its stunning natural beauty, but also opened a dangerous window for serious problems later down the road. But at this point, the OCT group didn't have to worry about those problems, they just had to worry about opening the park up successfully. OCT East featured 3 distinct zones or areas which all opened up in different phases. The first one was T-Stream Valley in July of 2007. T-Stream Valley really had nothing to do with theme parks. It had no roller coasters, no dark rides, no attractions at all aside from a few shows. What it really was is an enormous collection of walking trails and interactive experiences that encapsulate the beauty of the environment surrounding the place. This was ecotourism at its purest, the embodiment of the mix of traditional Chinese culture and the natural beauty of the area. The sheer spectacle of the beautiful scenery combined with man-made structures that highlight the OCT group's mastery in architecture made this one of the most complete walk-through nature parks Asia had ever seen. And the aforementioned shows were huge in scale, requiring hundreds of actors. This was something rarely seen outside of pure show-focused parks like Puy du Fou's portfolio. The whole place stretched for miles, with electric trams and shuttles just to help people get around. It was designed primarily to immerse guests in the surroundings. The second area to debut was Wind Valley, which opened its doors a few months after T-Stream Valley did. This part of the resort really emphasized the luxury experience that OCT East promised, and was similar to T-Stream Valley in that it focused on natural integration instead of thrills. This area featured green hiking trails, waterfalls, and meditation spaces, all tied together by one of the largest and most scenic golf courses in China. Wind Valley's 2 golf courses were absolutely breathtaking, a dream for the middle-class audience of the park. To be able to play 36 spectacular holes of golf in an environment as fantastic as this would almost certainly draw in a massive number of wealthy visitors from all around the country and even the world. Golf enthusiasts would call it a considerable test of someone's ability, making it a bucket list destination for sports tourists, even being the largest golf course in the entirety of China upon its opening. The third and final part of the resort to open was the actual theme park, Night Valley, but we'll go in for a deep dive there later on. Because even though OCT East already had 3 distinct zones for all different kinds of activities, there was still more to this massive place. To go along with the zones and make the location a true resort-like experience, OCT East contained 8 hotels, many of them being 5-star mega hotels, which included the Inner Lake and Town Hotel. This particular hotel was part of a section of OCT East fully themed to a Swiss mountain village, complete with flags and European architecture. As per the naturalistic integration of the resorts, these hotels were designed with the atmosphere in mind, existing as if they were always a part of the natural environment in all of the various sections. In addition to these hotels, OCT East had a multitude of restaurants and shops, with famous franchises and brands jumping at the opportunity to be featured in what would surely be the Disneyland of tomorrow. There was also an entire functioning temple in the middle of the resort. This spot, called Dahuaxing Temple, was a full Buddhist temple where guests of the resort could visit and pray. This ended up being one of the most popular spots at OCT East, with its fantastic architecture and golden iconography. The crown jewel of OCT East would be the last part of the complex to open. Night Valley was a massive, sprawling theme park with one of the best locations of any park in the world. This was to be the epitome of the OCT group's experience in the theme park world, the flagship part of their flagship property. To even enter Night Valley, you'd have to take either a cable car or a massive escalator system to transport you up from the entrance of the resort all the way into the lush mountains above. The attractions themselves were naturally placed at various spots on this massive mountain, giving visitors the option to have a natural hiking route from ride to ride, or to take the aforementioned cable car or funicular that would also connect them. Speaking of rides, once in the park, visitors were met with a decent collection of attractions. Now, OCT East by no means opened with a number of rides you'd expect from one of the top amusement parks in the world, but keep in mind, this park wasn't focused on rides and had all the expansion space in the world to naturally grow into a full theme park. Since Wood Coaster didn't open with the rest of Night Valley, the park's headliner was undoubtedly the 130-foot tall Log Flume mentioned at the beginning of the video. Despite being built over 15 years ago, this would still have been the biggest log flume in the world today by a significant margin. It was manufactured by Bear Rides, now Swiss Rides, and what's most interesting is that the ride's height wasn't even the most impressive thing about it. Instead, it was the flume's sheer length and its spectacular incorporation into the surrounding area. The ride's lift hill even went through the lobby of one of the park's 8 hotels, built on this enormous rock wall facade with the drop going through the other side, diving under an artificial waterfall, which was the tallest in China. In addition, the flume was unbelievably long, likely the longest in the world. While footage of this ride is extremely limited, like a lot of attractions at OCT East, and no POV has ever been released anywhere, it seems like you could see some of the ride from most of the main viewing spots in the park. This log flume was arguably the peak of water ride design, years ahead of other projects being built at a similar time, and it's something that has yet to be replicated in sheer scale more than 15 years later. In addition to the log flume, Night Valley had another water ride, a chute-to-chute that has remained open far longer. While there's nothing inherently special about this ride aside from its majestic backdrop, chute-to-chutes are always fun, and it would prove to be a staple for the park's lineup going forward. The park's signature dark ride was 4,000 Miles to Earth's Center, a simulator unabashedly themed to the famous Jules Verne story Journey to the Center of the Earth. The ride experience itself was ambitious for the time but fairly lackluster for modern standards, relying on both screens and practical sets to tell its simplistic story. The system is clearly inspired by dark rides at more well-established resorts around the world, similar to the Spider-Man dark rides at Universal, but with a significantly lesser budget and probably a less immersive overall experience. One of the park's more thrilling attractions was Jungle Cart, one of the world's most impressive weekend bob carts, a ride similar in style to Maximus Blitzbahn at Toverland. Riders controlled their speed so you could control how fast or slow you wanted to go, either speeding down the track or taking time to soak in the environment. Despite Night Valley being a theme park, Jungle Cart was the only attraction upon opening that came close to being a roller coaster, depending on what you count as one. What set Jungle Cart apart and made it special was the same as other attractions in the resort, the environment. Isolated from the park and built into the jungle, the ride offered sweeping views of the surrounding mountains and rainforest. Its layout twisted through thick forestry and hugged the edges of cliffs, much like a mountain coaster. It was also reportedly the second longest weekend bob cart in the world, which allowed riders to further explore the nature surrounding them. Because of Night Valley's location and its position on the hillside, one of the most exciting experiences for visitors was going all the way to the top of the mountain. To get up there, you'd have to take more transportation, in this case a sky ride. Well, either that or walk up 2,400 steps. Once at the top of the mountain, visitors were met with a spectacular view of Shenzhen's lush mountains all around them. There were also a few things to do up here besides just looking at the mountains. You could go further out on this observation deck with a glass floor that hovered over a 1,000-foot drop, or ride this small observation tower if you want to go even higher. In addition to the attractions focusing on the view, there were also 2 Fabry boosters up here, intense flat rides that are now the only ones of their kind left in the world. There was also one final major ride that opened with the park, Space Journey, which was an enclosed centrifuge-type simulator built on a tower. We'll get back to that ride in more detail in a bit since it had major implications on the park going forward. To go along with Night Valley's major rides were several children's attractions, interactive experiences, and a few shows. The biggest of these, a water stunt show, drew in lots of guests and was one of the most popular things to do at the park. So that's what OCT East opened with. 3 parks, all different in purpose, with hotels, shops, and restaurants connecting them. This place was already huge, and that's not even counting the expansions that would come later, like them building an entire water park. To give you an idea of just how massive this resort is, here's some context. Cedar Point, Alton Towers, Energylandia, and all 4 Disney World parks are known as some of the largest theme parks in the world in terms of land. But when you add the land of all 7 of them up, OCT East Resort is still bigger. The sheer amount of space this park takes up is impressive in its own right, but the problem of immense size fostered some creative solutions to inter-resort transportation. Because the property is so large, OCT East offers many modes of transportation for visitors, just so they're able to traverse the park without having to walk for an hour to get from ride to ride, or even longer to get from area to area. There's sky rides and cable cars, which can be found at a few parks, but there were also motorcycles that are available to rent. I find it really hard to wrap my head around the idea of speeding through a theme park on a motorcycle, but that's how things work at OCT East, I guess. So when the resort finally opened, how was it received? Well, it's kinda hard to tell. Because OCT East is remote and located in the part of the world that it is, information, opinions, and news coverage regarding the park is hard to come by on the Western internet. However, from what information we were able to gather, initial reviews generally said that it fell short of the premium resort-like experience that had been promised. OCT East seemed to have many of the same problems that plague other large parks upon opening, such as the lack of major attractions, accommodation, and efficient operations. But it was new, it was exciting, and at the time it worked. An experience so novel and interesting wasn't going to be shunned by the public, at least while it still was novel and interesting. So upon opening, OCT seemed to do just fine. But some of the cracks in the resort's foundation were starting to show. It was hard to get around there, offerings were limited, and the attitude of the staff there was hit or miss. Going back to transportation in particular, one of the resort's major issues even upon opening was a lack of available transport to get there. Despite being called OCT East Shenzhen, the resort was over an hour away from the center of Shenzhen by car, with a very complex system of public transport to get there that took multiple hours. It's also important to keep in mind that this place was literally located in the mountains. For all intents and purposes, it was in the middle of nowhere. Nobody lived close to it, and it was hard to get to it. When you add those factors together, no matter how good your resort is, you're going to struggle to get an abundance of visitors. Despite some minor difficulties upon opening, OCT East certainly wouldn't be classified as a failure just yet. After all, they had lots of land and room to expand, with a huge coaster in the pipeline for the following year. At that time, the resort was trending upwards and had a very bright future. The dream of becoming one of the biggest resorts in the world was still alive, but that dream would soon become a horrific nightmare. Remember Space Journey, the ride I said would have massive implications on the park's future? Well, on June 29, 2010, less than a year after Night Valley opened, Space Journey had one of the worst accidents in theme park history. To understand what really happened with Space Journey, we need to understand how this one-of-a-kind attraction operated. As mentioned earlier, Space Journey was essentially a modified centrifuge. A centrifuge is a type of ride often found at carnivals in which riders are placed in a mechanism that spins rapidly. This creates centripetal force that pins guests to the inner edge of the ride system. Oftentimes, the ride's floor will then drop, but riders still stay pinned to the wall because of the force. There were two things unique about Space Journey that differentiated it from other centrifuges. First off, riders were placed in separate cabins. Instead of all being together in a big bowl-like area, Space Journey contained 12 smaller cabins, each containing 4 people. These cabins were located on arms that extended from the ride's central hub. The second difference was even more important. In order to simulate the sensation of flight, the cabins on Space Journey were attached to a 50-foot tall tower. The revolution of the cabins, combined with the elevation change, was what gave the ride its uniqueness, as it was the only ride of its kind that had ever been built. So here's the full story. Back in 2007, when OCT East first had the idea to build the type of ride that would end up being Space Journey, they reached out to the General Assembly Design Institute, a Chinese manufacturing and design organization, to build the attraction. The General Assembly Design Institute then split the project into 2 different parts and subcontracted 2 different companies to manage each part. One of those companies was Beijing Zhihua Amusement Rides, which was responsible for the installation and commissioning of the ride. Before the accident, Beijing Zhihua was the only company publicly known to have constructed Space Journey, but they were actually only responsible for the installation. The actual design and manufacturing of the ride was managed by Beijing Yimeibo Technology Company, hereafter referred to as Yimeibo. The chief engineer of Yimeibo at the time was this man. This is Yang Shishang, a highly respected pioneer of hydraulic engineering. He's worked for multiple companies and has made many innovations in hydraulics throughout his life. He was born in 1938, so when he was tasked with building Space Journey, he was nearly 70. Again, Yang Shishang was the chief engineer of Yimeibo when Space Journey was commissioned, and he worked alongside his son, Yang Tao, and another man, Yang Guangnong, on the project. Both Shishang and Tao were decorated and well-respected scientists, regarded as some of the best hydraulic engineers in the country. Yang Shishang introduced a new type of hydraulic system called a third degree of freedom motion platform that was to be used on Space Journey. He shared his new development on the Chinese forum gongkong.com on June 18, 2007, where he was met with overwhelmingly positive feedback by other Chinese hydraulics experts. In the post, which now seems to be archived, Shishang explained the benefits of the new system and claimed that it had almost no problems. This was the system that Yimeibo ended up installing on Space Journey. 2 years later, the ride opened to the public, and a year after that, disaster struck. Space Journey was operating as it usually did at around 4 p.m. on June 29, 2010. At that point, near the beginning of the ride cycle, one of the cabins detached from the arm that connected it to the tower and crashed to the ground. Reports indicate that there was a loud bang sound, likely from the explosion of the cabin hitting the ground, and an immediate power outage. After the initial crash, the downed cabin caught fire as the other cabins returned to the ground. Since Space Journey was enclosed, all riders were essentially trapped in a burning building that was quickly filling up with fire and smoke with no way to get out. Eventually, firefighters came in to rescue the riders. However, their efforts came too late for some, as 6 people died. The 4 in the cabin that crashed, and 2 more from the ensuing fire. 3 of the 6 died then and there, and the other 3 people were rushed to the nearby Meisha Hospital, where they succumbed to intense 4th-degree burns and respiratory damage from smoke inhalation. Along with the 6 casualties, 10 more were severely injured and hospitalized. No other accident in modern theme park history has come close to this amount of carnage. The negative effect that the Space Journey disaster had on OCT East Resort cannot be understated. Following the accident, OCT East and the ride's alleged manufacturer, Beijing Zhihu Amusement Rides, were both investigated thoroughly by Chinese inspection agencies. This led to a criminal case regarding liability and responsibility regarding the accident that lasted for years following the initial crash, in which 8 people were placed on trial. The investigation also revealed truths about the case that led to a complete reform in Chinese amusement safety laws. According to the accident report, the official cause of the Space Journey disaster was that the M16 bolts that held the arms together were not structurally secure and had been weakened by a lack of proper care and maintenance from the park. Despite Yang Shishang's assurances that the new hydraulic system for the ride was essentially perfect, he had failed to review the design sufficiently and had made calculation errors in the force that would be exerted, which resulted in the installation of M16 bolts instead of M22 bolts, which should have been used. In the testing and inspection process for the ride, representatives from 2 different companies found that the M16 bolts were there in place of the M22s, but still approved the ride to operate as normal. Upon further calculations, they figured that there would be no notable difference in the stress created, and that the M16 bolts were safe to be there. However, the true underlying reason for there not being a complete bolt replacement was likely that the process would be long and expensive. Everyone involved agreed that this would be good enough to function, so long as OCT East performed sufficient maintenance and regular inspections of the ride. Of course, it wasn't good enough. Everyone involved in the project was found guilty of criminal negligence and sent to prison. Yang Shishang, despite his arguments that he was not at fault, was sentenced to 5 years in jail. The 2 others he worked with were also found guilty, but received lesser sentences. In addition, the members of the inspection parties that greenlit the M16 bolts were convicted, as well as Huang Xiaojun, the person in charge of Night Valley's operation, Ying Hua, Space Journey's project supervisor, and Chen Deyao, the maintenance foreman. In total, all 8 people put on trial for the Space Journey case were found guilty. The accident and the result of the case had a particular negative effect on Yang Shishang. After the situation, he suffered from multiple critical illnesses, including coronary artery disease, grade 3 hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and more. He was released from prison on medical parole due to these conditions. Today, although public information is limited regarding his condition, it seems as if Shishang is medically stable and continues to work with one of his companies, Aemetec, and has been associated with new patents for hydraulics technology. But back to the accident itself. Immediately after the Space Journey disaster, but before the criminal investigation, news of the event spread like wildfire both across China and the rest of the world. The result of the accident affected some parties involved much more than the other. Beijing Zhihu Amusement Rides, the company that installed Space Journey, has gone on to become a fairly successful Chinese roller coaster manufacturer. In addition, YiMeiBo, now associated with Aemetec, is still in the hydraulic space. OCT East, on the other hand, struggled to recover from the disaster. Stock prices for the resort plummeted, and so did interest from the rest of the world regarding the Chinese amusement industry. The general consensus quickly shifted. To the wider world, Chinese amusement products as a whole seemed unsafe. In the case of Space Journey, there was certainly merit to that statement. Before the attraction ever opened to the public, it was verified as safe by the manufacturer, the park, and third-party Chinese inspection agencies. On paper, everything had been signed off. It was supposed to be safe. And yet, the very bolts holding the ride together were improperly sized. The design calculations were flawed, and disaster struck because of it. Following the accident, Chinese amusement park safety laws were completely overhauled. Now all Chinese parks follow the same kinds of inspections and checks as others in the US, Europe, and all over the world to ensure that a disaster like what happened on Space Journey never happens again. The OCT Group, too, was forced to reckon with the consequences. Their flagship park had now become the site of one of the deadliest ride accidents in modern history. Of course, they complied with every policy and reform introduced to them, but to the public it was all in vain. The damage was already done. Just 1 year after Night Valley opened to guests, it experienced something that would be extremely difficult to bounce back from. Essentially, this was the beginning of the end for the park, and by extension, the resort as a whole. In its first year, OCT East showed signs of struggle. Attendance was lower than expected, but there was still a sense of optimism. After all, lots of parks underperform immediately upon opening. They had hope that once word spread and marketing kicked in, the crowds would come. Space Journey was meant to be part of that draw as a technological marvel that symbolized the park's ambition. But instead, the ride had the opposite effect. OCT East was supposed to be a world-class resort with world-class attractions, but who would visit the resort if the attractions weren't safe? It turns out, not many people. In a culture where public trust plays a massive role in consumer behavior, the incident's fallout was devastating. And to make matters worse, the aforementioned investigation dragged on for years, and initial confusion around who was truly responsible only deepened public skepticism. As a result of this, shareholders believed that OCT East was spending too much money staying open compared to the money it was bringing in, which was backed up by the numbers. It was obvious that the resort needed to cut back on some things, and that meant scaling back their offerings and attractions, at least until the Space Journey coverage died down. Following the accident, Night Valley shut down entirely for several days as officials scrambled to inspect the park under the spotlight of new safety scrutiny. Even after the park's reopening, many individual rides remained closed for extended checks, part of a sweeping effort to meet the updated national safety standards that the Space Journey disaster helped usher in. Yet, while almost all of these rides reopened shortly after, what was arguably the park's flagship attraction didn't survive through these tough times. Night Valley's record-breaking Log Flume, which had opened just over a year prior, was one of the rides that stayed closed following the park's reopening. This closure continued in the weeks and eventually months following, to the point where it stayed closed for the entire rest of the 2010 theme park season. In the off-season, rumors swirled Chinese forums regarding the ride, with many believing the manufacturer of the ride, Bear Rides, was upgrading it for the next season. Instead, the opposite happened. Shortly after the ride's closure, every mention of the legendary flume was erased from their site. The only thing linking the manufacturer and the ride is this one video left on Bear Ride's YouTube channel, one of the only videos in existence showing the ride in operation. The following year, the ride remained closed, and at this point everyone knew what was happening. It was never going to reopen. Now, what usually happens when major rides close is simple. They're demolished and then taken off-site. But with Night Valley's Log Flume, nothing was done at all by the park to remove it in order to possibly build something in its place. In fact, nothing was done at all. It stayed right where it was. This was perhaps due to its integration with the nearby hotel, its huge size, or how deeply intertwined it was in the front side of the park. Maybe the park somehow even hoped to reopen it sometime. But unfortunately for visitors of Night Valley, it's continued to stay there to this day. For 14 years, this massive mythical amusement ride has slowly deteriorated, engulfed by the nature it was built into. And because of its impossibly large scale somehow traversing the already enormous Night Valley, the flume's decaying remnants can be seen all throughout the park, a reminder of what it once was and what the park had aimed to be. The flume truly was a monstrous ride, something built at a scale the theme park world had never seen before, and never has since its closure. Maybe someday another park will build another water ride as tall, fast, and long as this one. But for now, the king of log flumes lies dead, assassinated by the tragic circumstances surrounding it. At this time in the resort's history, OCT East was in a strange place. On paper, it was still massive, still unique, and still one of the most visually stunning theme park destinations in the world. But the resort didn't open with the success that it hoped for, and what happened with Space Journey put a permanent dent in the park's reputation that would be hard to overcome. Internally, the resort started to change. As previously mentioned, a few rides closed down permanently, but aspects that weren't as apparent began to decline as well. With attendance decreasing, things like live entertainment and quality operations took a backseat to ensuring that the resort stayed afloat during this tough time. What was once ambition now became retreat, at least for the time being, while the resort's image recovered in the eyes of the public. But OCT East had a plan. Despite all these problems, OCT East still had an ace up its sleeve, in the form of a major project that would act as a headlining attraction for the resort and could possibly be the best coaster in the world upon its opening. The OCT Group and GCI had been working together closely on a huge terrain coaster since the resort's opening in 2009. OCT East was desperate to have an attraction that wouldn't only draw in visitors from the local area, but finally make OCT East a Disneyland of sorts, where it could attract visitors from all across Asia and beyond, with its various parks and larger-than-life layout. The embodiment of this idea was Wood Coaster. OCT East didn't just want a good ride that attracted local guests, they wanted a world-class one that made the resort impossible to ignore. OCT turned to Great Coasters International, or GCI, to build this ride. At that time, GCI was undoubtedly the top wooden coaster manufacturer, having built rides like Thunderhead at Dollywood and Troy at Toverland. Wood Coaster was to be GCI's magnum opus just as much as it was meant to be OCT East's. The ride was the tallest, fastest, and longest coaster GCI had built thus far by a large margin, but the integration into the mountainside made the design and construction much tougher. There were some problems during construction with footers and supports because of the surroundings that increased the cost of the ride by a few $1 million and delayed the opening by a few months, but again the terrain also made the coaster much better. While we will never know the full extent of the creative process behind the ride, it was clear that the park spared no expense whatsoever in creating one of the largest and most impressive wooden coasters ever conceived. Wood Coaster was an awe-inspiring creation that stood out not just within China, but also in the global coaster community. With a track length exceeding 4,500 feet, Wood Coaster offered a ride experience that was intense as it was long. Enthusiasts who managed to make the journey to Shenzhen were rewarded with a coaster that many described as the best in the world. Its blend of speed, airtime, and scenery was unparalleled, quickly becoming the standout attraction the park always wanted. And even if you forget about the amazing scenery, the layout on its own is fantastic. It combines everything great about GCI into one ride, featuring their signature moments of airtime, laterals, and extremely fast pacing. It also has lots of unique sections for GCI like a straight drop, some repeated off-axis hills, and plenty of other moments that utilize the terrain to create unpredictable elements. It's commonly referred to as GCI's masterpiece even 15 years after it opened, and looks to be a top 5 wooden coaster in the world, depending on who you ask. OCT East sought perfection from GCI, and they absolutely got it with Wood Coaster. However, despite the ride's relative success, the issues facing OCT East were far from over. Wood Coaster was a promising sign for the resort, but it still struggled to attract the number of visitors it needed to sustain itself. The remote location, combined with the damage caused by the Space Journey accident, continued to hamper its potential in the worldwide market. If the resort truly wanted to compete with the largest players in the world, they first needed more attractions. It's easy to look at Night Valley as a theme park on its own, but where the trouble for OCT came was in both the park and the resort as a whole's connection to the broader Chinese amusement industry. OCT East was built in the middle of the Chinese theme park boom, and during the time it had its problems, other parks jumped ahead of it with promising starts. Southeast China, the region where OCT East Resort is located, had many other theme parks in addition to OCT East. Parks that were more accessible, had more quality rides, and didn't house the worst accident in modern theme park history. While OCT East was struggling, these parks such as Chimelong Ocean Kingdom and Hong Kong Disneyland were thriving. OCT East was simply playing catch-up. Even the addition of Wood Coaster went more or less overlooked in the region's theme park space. In the same year, Hong Kong Disneyland opened Grizzly Gulch, Mystic Point, and Toy Story Land, all high-quality additions. It was obvious that to get to the same appeal, the OCT group had to fully commit to the resort. However, Hong Kong Disneyland's attractions were some of the highest quality attractions Disney had ever made, also utilizing some of the large amounts of intellectual property the Disney Corporation owned, leading to increased merchandise sales and more revenue streams. Speaking of merchandise, like many other enthusiasts, nothing makes me sadder than visiting a park and not finding anything worthwhile to take home as a souvenir, or the merchandise that I do end up getting there to be not great. That's why I love Art Parks. Art Parks is a theme park fashion startup coming from a pure love of all things theme parks. It was started by Freddie, the same person who helped me a ton on this video. The first collection launched in 2024, celebrating the community's love for one of the world's best theme parks, Fuji-Q Highland, taking inspiration from parts of Japanese culture and the park itself to create a truly unique collection that reflects everything about the park and its surroundings. Best part is, you can get it on a t-shirt, hoodie, or even just a print complete with a frame. The first half of a clothing-specific collection inspired by Thorpe Park released, with more collections coming soon. If this sounds like something that might interest you, check out the link in the video description to see the full collection. But back to OCT East. The addition of Wood Coaster was definitely a step in the right direction, but it quickly became apparent that the resort needed to take more steps just like it if it were to compete with other expanding parks in the area, like Hong Kong Disneyland, and be a major player in the continued emergence of the Chinese amusement industry as a whole. But in the few years it had been open, OCT East had suffered loss after loss. Underwhelming crowds upon opening, a horrible accident, major ride closures, and a Hail Mary that was maybe their last chance to draw people to the resort that was more or less failing. It was clear that the park was dying and doing so without ever really getting off the ground. At this point, it's 2012, a year after Wood Coaster opened. And this is it. Aside from a few attractions closing, this is pretty much the OCT East resort that the OCT group had envisioned building. All of its zones and hotels had opened, yet it still wasn't drawing in the attendance that had been hoped for, and more importantly, the attendance needed to keep the resort afloat. The struggle that plagued OCT East's first few years wasn't by random chance. There were many factors that led to the resort's initial hardships, some of which I want to take a look at here. Let's get the obvious one out of the way first, the Space Journey accident. A massive crash like that, especially one that garnered worldwide media attention, not only made people question visiting OCT, but lowered people's trust in amusement safety as a whole. The Chinese amusement industry was rapidly growing at the time, and under more extreme circumstances, the Space Journey disaster could have even led to the death of the amusement industry in that part of the world. But while Chinese theme parks as a whole survived the scrutiny that came from the accident, OCT East mostly did not. Like it or not, that one incident had a devastating effect on the park. But even if the Space Journey disaster had never happened, I still believe OCT East would have faced an uphill battle to stay afloat, let alone thrive, and here's why. This place was as ambitious as it was enormous. Calling it a park or even a resort doesn't really even capture what they were going for. The idea of OCT East was closer in spirit to a self-contained mountain town carved into the hills of Shenzhen with the goal of entertaining every type of guest, from coaster enthusiasts to theme park fans to hikers, golfers, families, and everyone in between. And while it never reached the scale of a full-on city, the sheer footprint of the resort strongly suggests that much larger expansion plans were on the table from the start. But from day one, the resort aimed at the wrong audience. Local theme park goers might come out to ride Night Valley's coasters a couple of times, but they weren't sticking around for everything else. And to add on that everything else was a wide-ranging eclectic collection of offerings. A massive nature park, a full-scale golf course, a Buddhist temple, European-style themed villages, high-end hotels, and an emphasis on scenic immersion. The idea was to cast a wide net and draw in travelers from all over China, and even from abroad. But the execution never matched the ambition. OCT East was trying to be everything at once without establishing a clear identity, which diluted its impact. Add to that the logistical nightmare of maintaining such a huge property built on mountainous terrain far from civilization, and the operational cracks started to show quickly. Attractions closed unexpectedly, infrastructure began to deteriorate, and the overall guest experience didn't deliver the kind of polish or consistency you'd expect from a destination trying to rival Disneyland. So even in the best case scenario, no Space Journey, no bad press, the core issue remained. OCT East was trying to build a luxury-level multi-park resort without fully understanding the audience it was building for, and without the systems in place to maintain it at the quality level it promised. It was a bold project, but one that was always destined to collapse under its own weight. However, there's absolutely a way for a similar concept to flourish. 5 years after OCT East Resort did, a similar nature-themed park opened a couple hours away. This was Chimelong Ocean Kingdom, located in Zhuhai, China. Almost immediately, Chimelong became known as one of the premier theme parks in the country. Since then, it's gone back and forth with Shanghai Disneyland, a Disney park in China's biggest city by far, for the most visited theme park in the country. And it's also surpassed Hong Kong Disneyland. But the interesting thing about Chimelong Ocean Kingdom is that its rise in popularity highlighted exactly where OCT East had failed. At their hearts, both resorts were the same thing. Nature-themed resorts containing rides and animal exhibits with a desire to become China's biggest and best tourist destination. But where OCT East's first few years failed because it crumbled under its own weight, Chimelong executed perfectly. The resorts differed greatly in what they decided to focus on in their opening years. OCT East never truly decided its focus. It wavered back and forth between so many ideas, immediately building to a massive scale but never settling on the foundation. It tried to appeal to everyone, and usually when you do that, you end up appealing to no one. And that's exactly what happened. Chimelong, on the other hand, had a clear identity from the start, an ocean-themed park with strong animal experiences and great rides, all connected under one label. To put it simply, Chimelong Ocean Kingdom is a bigger and better version of the US SeaWorld parks. It's akin to something like SeaWorld Abu Dhabi, if you're familiar with that place. Chimelong Ocean Kingdom had aspirations for becoming a massive resort, but it started with just one theme park. Even though the scale was smaller than OCT East, Chimelong was ready to succeed. It opened in a thriving area in the middle of the Chinese theme park boom with a precise strategy on what it was supposed to be and who it was supposed to be. But even more than the planning stages, Chimelong Ocean Kingdom outshined OCT East in its execution upon opening. Chimelong spent a lot of money before it even opened, and as a result ended up opening as a complete park. This contrasts OCT East, which was massive with attractions scattered everywhere and requiring long walks just to get from one place to the next. Chimelong Ocean Kingdom opened with 3 major coasters, a B&M wing coaster called Parrot Coaster, and 2 water coasters built by Mach and Intamin, which further reinforced the park's ocean theme. In addition to the rides, Chimelong utilized aquariums as well as interactions with fish and other ocean animals. They also built huge structures to go along with the rest of the park. Chimelong Ocean Kingdom was incredibly smart compared to OCT East in terms of how it approached scale. Instead of focusing on an assortment of things, Chimelong targeted their focus on first building a solid theme park that would attract visitors from around the country, providing a quality experience that left visitors wanting to return and telling others about the great time they had there. They then continued to add to the theme park until it was time a few years later to expand to a full ocean resort. Chimelong Ocean Kingdom added hotels, restaurants, and shops, and in 2023 they opened their second park, Chimelong Spaceship, which is the world's largest indoor theme park. It has no roller coasters, just a few interactive experiences, and a major focus on ocean habitats and animal interactions. This is essentially the T-Stream Valley of Chimelong, but a lot better. With these new additions, Chimelong Ocean Kingdom became a whole resort and changed its name to Chimelong International Ocean Tourist Resort. It plans to keep adding, with a 3rd theme park in the pipeline for the following few years. 3 parks themed around nature. Where have we heard that before? Speaking of that, let's snap back to 2012 and let's snap back to OCT East Resort. OCT East mismanaged its opening years, and at this point the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Despite early optimism, the resort failed to deliver an experience that could justify its massive scale or ambitious goals. But that failure wasn't because the resort was inherently bad, at least compared to what it would later become. Initial reviews pointed out the potential. Wood Coaster was a genuine standout, and the park's natural beauty made up for the other areas it lacked in. But that's where the praise ended. Outside of Wood Coaster, the rest of Night Valley lacked greatness. The rides were generic, forgettable, and in some cases poorly maintained. Most guests who visited would try each attraction once or twice, but few found anything worth coming back for. The other sections of the resort, like the hotels, golf course, and themed towns, were serviceable but unremarkable. They couldn't compete with what more upscale destinations like Chimelong or Hong Kong Disneyland were offering just a few hours away. This created a dangerous problem. OCT East was built to be a multi-day experience, a place where guests would stay, explore, and spend. But it never earned that level of engagement. Most visitors came for a day, experienced what they were interested in, and left without ever touching the rest of the resort. For a property built on the assumption of extended stays and repeat business, that's essentially a death sentence. The more you look at the reports and guest impressions from this time, the more obvious the core problem becomes. OCT East massively overestimated what they could pull off. The entire resort, and especially Night Valley, was designed at a scale that implied world-class quality and depth, but that depth just wasn't there. The park was massive, yes, but what filled that space didn't justify the walk, let alone the visit. It felt hollow, like a blueprint that never got past the planning phase. Night Valley in particular is one of the largest theme parks on Earth by land area, yet it operated like a regional park with a handful of forgettable attractions scattered far apart. The layout forced guests to trek long distances between rides that were underwhelming, repetitive, and outdated. It gave off the illusion of a grand destination, but the experience never matched that scale. Instead of feeling immersive or exciting, most of the park felt like filler. Empty plazas, unused paths, entire zones that looked like they were waiting for something that never got built. This disconnect between scale and execution created a fundamental identity crisis for OCT East. They built like they wanted to be a global player, but they ran the place like they were just hoping enough locals would show up on weekends. There was no clear target audience, no compelling hook to bring people back, and nothing consistent holding the resort's identity together. Another issue that came up very frequently in reviews from this point onwards was the attitude of lots of members of park staff. Visitors routinely complained about employees being indifferent at best and flat out rude at worst. To say the least, OCT East was in trouble at this point in their history. They were at a huge crossroads and essentially had two ways to handle the problem of a dying resort. The first option was for the OCT group to cut their losses and sell off parts of the resort, to recoup whatever value was left in the real estate and walk away with a large sum of money for the property that could be reinvested into other parks. It's possible they tried this, but if they did, it either never went public or no buyers were interested in acquiring the resort. No deal ever went through and the park stayed open. The other option would be to continue to invest in the resort. The idea would be that the OCT group could pour so much money into improving it, like Chimlong did at the beginning with Ocean Kingdom, that the philosophy would essentially be it's too good for people to ignore. That would have been a high-risk play for the company, but also the only play if they wanted to truly realize the dream that was this resort. If the OCT group had gone all in on this property, investing heavily during its dark days, there could very well have been growth if circumstances were right. But the OCT group didn't invest in the resort, and it didn't sell either. OCT East continued to operate over the following years like any other stable property. Instead of a bold move, the group decided to let the resort remain how it was. However, this strategy on its own was not financially stable. So over the next few years, from 2012 onward, something interesting happened. OCT East knew that it was too big to operate and sustain with the kind of attendance it was drawing. It would lose a substantial amount of money year after year if it were to operate like normal. So gradually, over the years, some parts of the resort just stopped operating. Attractions were abandoned, hotels closed without explanation, and whole areas fell silent. These portions of the resort were abandoned with no reason except for the fact that they could not continue to operate in order for the park to turn any semblance of a profit. But this created an even worse problem. What does a park look like when it does this for a 5-year, 10-year time frame, continually shutting down large areas because they aren't popular enough? For the first couple years, it had no extreme impact and honestly worked better than it should have. Rides that were closed were assumed to be down for extended maintenance, poor operations were simply an inconvenience and not indicative of a major staffing issue, and who really cared if 1 or 2 hotels closed as long as the premier ones stayed open? This strategy seemed to be working. OCT East was still turning a decent profit according to financial data available because it had scaled down its ambitions. Sure, this meant a downgrade in almost all senses for park guests, but the resort was surviving. And for a park in the state it was in, that's all it could really hope for. But this trend of continuously closing attractions and abandoning areas was not sustainable for the well-being of the resort. Year after year, OCT East got worse and worse. This period of time was essentially a vicious cycle. OCT East closed some of their offerings, so attendance decreased, so the park didn't make as much money, so they closed more. Eventually, there would come a point where OCT East simply didn't have enough to offer to justify a visit, certainly not a multi-day one. This point would be different in everyone's eyes. For some people it had already occurred a long time ago, for some people it was closely approaching, but for coaster enthusiasts it likely wouldn't be until Wood Coaster itself closed and started to decay. By the late 2010s, the deterioration of the park started to become extremely noticeable. Upon entering the resort, the decay was obvious. Parts of old buildings had crumbled, rides were overgrown, pathways were covered in mold, but somehow it was still hanging on by a thread. The fact that the park was still open despite the terrible state it was in showed how far OCT East was willing to go to avoid throwing in the towel on what was supposed to be their magnum opus. At that time, around 2019, the state the resort was in was impossible to ignore. Almost every review from them mentions its deteriorating nature or the plethora of closed attractions at Night Valley. One report in particular by the Coaster Kings calls it a ghost resort, a frighteningly accurate statement. I first read this report a few years ago and became immediately intrigued with this place. I'll link it in the description as it presents a blunt overview on the park in the late 2010s from a Western perspective. Of course, the most obvious sign of the resort's decline was the decomposition of old structures and the moss that had overtaken them. From regular buildings to walkways to abandoned rides to entire hotels, everything was overgrown and overtaken by the greenery that surrounded it. The irony here is almost too perfect. This resort had branded itself focusing on harmony with nature and spreading awareness regarding the importance of the environment. Now that same environment had swallowed the park whole, making it almost impossible to ignore. Maybe that was OCT's plan all along, and if so, mission accomplished, I guess. But if we're going to talk about nature, we have to go over one of the most unsettling signs that OCT East was falling apart, its animal exhibits. As previously mentioned, the park positioned itself as a nature-centric destination from the very beginning. It wasn't just roller coasters and hotels, it was walking paths through the forest, themed gardens, and specifically animal enclosures designed to give guests a closer connection to the natural world. For a while, those exhibits probably functioned like they were supposed to. Early reports suggest they were decently staffed and maintained, with the animals kept in relatively humane conditions. But as the years wore on and the result crumbled around them, these exhibits were clearly not spared from the decline. Especially in the park's later years, the conditions of the exhibits began to deteriorate drastically. Multiple visitors have noted that the enclosures appear overcrowded and far too small for the animals inside. Some of those animals seem lethargic, while others exhibit signs of distress. Even worse, reports imply that the level of care, attention, and supervision these animals receive has dropped off significantly, likely due to shrinking budgets and an understaffed workforce. It's hard to verify every detail from a distance, but taken together, the pattern paints a bleak picture. This is where the morality behind operating a resort in the fashion OCT East did becomes questionable at best. Letting your buildings rot is one thing, but letting living creatures suffer is another. Now, I do want to clarify that animal welfare standards and cultural expectations vary significantly around the world. What might spark outrage in one country could be viewed as normal practice in another. In fact, it's not uncommon in some parts of Asia to see exotic animals sold casually, and OCT East itself reportedly sold live jellyfish in tiny sealed globes as souvenirs. But regardless of cultural context, these are still living beings confined to poorly maintained enclosures in a failing resort. I haven't witnessed this firsthand, and I don't want to claim certainty where there is none. But based on the accounts that do exist, it's clear the animal exhibits became yet another casualty of OCT East's slow collapse, and one that raises serious ethical questions about when a park should be allowed to continue operating at all. Another evident sign of the resort's deterioration was the abundant lack of open attractions. Night Valley had lacked a substantial number of things to do since it opened, but that small number had only continued to dwindle as rides shut down year after year. The entire kids area was abandoned, several other rides closed, and from what I can tell at this point it was down to no more than 6 or 7, a vision for one of the world's best theme parks reduced to this. But OCT East's issues extended far beyond Night Valley. Hotels and restaurants also shut down to the point where there were only a few remaining. Wind Valley, the golf course, shut down. T-Stream Valley was the only part of the resort that hadn't experienced a severe decline in quality. At this point, OCT East was at its most important crossroads yet. This was similar to the one it faced in 2012, but now ignoring the problem wasn't an option. Continued neglect for upkeep and maintenance meant that there would be a point where the resort couldn't close any more things without risking a drastic falloff in the already low number of visitors. So the choices were essentially the same: sell or expand. By this point, expansion was basically out of the picture. It would take one of the largest revitalization attempts in theme park history to restore this resort to any semblance of glory. Adding on to that, the OCT group had started to struggle financially, so there was really no hope of major investment. With the Chinese amusement industry continuing to grow just as fast as OCT East was falling, there were fewer reasons every year to visit this dying resort. It closed attractions while other parks continued to expand. Major players from the 2010s kept drawing in visitors and adding rides, and an influx of new parks all around the country from companies like Fantawald and Universal further diverted attention away from OCT East. The Chinese theme park landscape was fresh and exciting, and OCT East was the opposite of that. So this looked like the end for the resort. Without investment, they could either limp to the metaphorical finish line or call it quits then and there. Either way, the dream of a mega resort in the mountains was over. But they actually didn't end up having to make a decision, because just as the resort hit its breaking point, something drastic happened. The pandemic hit, and the world shut down. The 2020 COVID-19 pandemic had a detrimental impact on the whole world, in this case specifically the theme park world, and OCT East was no exception. Now, Shenzhen's initial lockdowns in the spring and summer of 2020 weren't nearly as long as those in other parts of the world. In fact, restrictions were lifted pretty quickly compared to some other countries. But the second and third waves hit the area even harder, with the most major outbreak coming in 2022. Much like the rest of the world, the economic effects of the pandemic were felt throughout the country. This hit the amusement industry especially hard. There were far fewer reasons for people to visit theme parks, even when there weren't any restrictions. For OCT East, the pandemic could be viewed as both a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing because it gave the park an acceptable reason to shut down temporarily and the chance to regroup without immediate pressure to make a decision. But it was a curse financially. Similar to other struggling businesses all throughout the world, the global financial loss decimated OCT East and backed it into a corner. When it reopened, it was clear that OCT simply couldn't sustain its current business model as long as there were pandemic concerns and economic issues plaguing the entire country of China. It was losing much more money than was financially viable, even with downsizing, and needed something to change considerably if it were to stay on its feet. Eventually, restrictions were lifted and things more or less went back to normal. OCT East was still a struggling resort, but now economically destroyed by the effects of the pandemic. To many, this seemed like the end of the resort, and for good reason. OCT East was losing money, as was the OCT group as a whole, and there was no hint of refurbishment to any of the dilapidated areas. Night Valley in particular took the hardest hit from the pandemic. After reopening in late 2022, it was a shell of its former self, even the version of it that existed in 2019. This sets the stage for what might be the most symbolic moment in OCT East's demise. For the past 10 years, the resort had been declining slowly, but there was still one major draw to the dying park, their crown jewel Wood Coaster. But after Night Valley reopened, Wood Coaster stayed closed. For nearly a decade, Wood Coaster had been the beating heart of OCT East. If you'd heard of this place before this video, Wood Coaster was likely the reason why. The idea of a world-class coaster trapped in the mountains of China was an interesting enough concept to intrigue anyone, including me. But much like the Log Flume had a decade prior, it simply didn't reopen with the rest of the park following a major disaster. First, it was listed as temporarily closed, but anyone who knew anything about OCT East's history knew somewhere deep down that temporarily closed would soon change to permanently. And they'd be right. The ride has continued to sit there, motionless and lifeless, for the past few years now, as the hollow remains of Night Valley drift into nothingness. Soon, Wood Coaster 2 will be overtaken by its own terrain. OCT East won't demolish it or give it a proper send-off, they'll just let it rot, which means Wood Coaster is truly dead. When I first heard of OCT East many years back, I dreamed of visiting it, no matter how far gone the resort was from its original promise. No matter how unlikely the chances of me somehow making it to Shenzhen were, I wanted to explore the half-abandoned park in the jungle and ride one of the best coasters in the world. It wouldn't have been a perfect experience, but it would have been an adventure. But now I'll never have the chance to, and neither will anyone else. Because Wood Coaster is gone. Not just closed, but also gone in spirit, swallowed by the very nature it once soared above. And with its death, so too dies the last remnants of what OCT East set out to be. So, to the ride that defied expectations and stood tall in the mountains while everything else around it fell apart, thank you. You didn't save the park, but you gave it something worth remembering. Goodbye, Wood Coaster, you deserved a lot better. Since the resort's reopening, many other attractions at Night Valley have suffered the same fate. It's now to the point where only 2 or 3 attractions and a show are open at a time, with other major rides like Jungle Cart as well as 4,000 Miles to Earth Center never reopening. Recent reviews of Night Valley itself are overwhelmingly negative, with people criticizing the even more run-down, abandoned nature of the park, and the fact that OCT is still charging the original price for it. People also say that there's essentially no staff or operators anywhere to be found. Some reviews claim that they take care of the animals more than they do the visitors, which I guess seems to be an improvement in some sense. Furthermore, OCT East's advertising and social media, through Chinese channels, has completely cut off any mention of Night Valley or its attractions. This is exactly what they did with their water park and golf course, Wind Valley, when they were abandoned. No official farewell, no notice that it was going to happen, they just packed up and left. So, with so much of the resort gone, what does OCT East even have to advertise anymore? Well, instead, what the resort shows off now are the sprawling nature and beautiful views. These are things that have been part of OCT East's identity since its inception, but there's also a major problem with this. And that's the fact that the resort has shifted completely and irreversibly from an enormous tourist town with an abundance of things to see and do, to a glorified scenic spot with resort prices. Wind Valley and the water park are gone, and Night Valley is on its deathbed, so the only area OCT can hold on to is T-Stream Valley. T-Stream Valley, of course, being their walking trail where you learn about tea. I don't know if that's enough to draw people into the mountains, but maybe I'm underestimating how fascinating tea is. Some more positives are that in addition to T-Stream Valley, the Interlaken Hotel and areas surrounding it are actually both alive and well, and doing rather positively in terms of guest feedback. OCT East is also capitalizing on its aforementioned natural beauty and has kept observation decks as well as a cable car through the mountains running for people to get to that area of Night Valley at the top of the mountain. The rides up there aren't open anymore, of course, but views never close. But again, that's what it's been reduced to. A scenic spot with a hotel losing millions of dollars every year, replacing what was dreamt to be the biggest themed resort in the world. But while OCT East may have been suffering from the theme park equivalent of a terminal illness, it still refused to die. Renovation, investments, and new projects were options for the resort even in its darkest times. And for a few years it actually seemed like a comeback of sorts was possible. Not a comeback to a global theme park player, but to a place that was secure in a newfound vision of an upscale scenic spot. In late 2022, OCT East signed a deal with hotel group Accor to bring more hotels to the area, and a year after that the resort expanded T-Stream Valley, adding new pathways as well as another observation deck, this time from the top of a mountain. These were certainly small steps in the right direction, but it also seemed like every time a new development was made, something else fell through. No new hotels have been built since the Accor partnership, the T-Stream Valley situation came with all kinds of disputes, and an ecological school partnership with an international group slipped through the cracks. The only successful development made in the past few years was a renovation for one of the resort's smaller hotels, the Oasis Glee Tour Hotel. While it's theoretically possible for OCT East to undergo a massive transformation, reality paints a much bleaker picture. Large-scale comebacks in the theme park industry are incredibly rare, and when they do happen they require a perfect storm of vision, leadership, financial firepower, and public interest. OCT East has none of those right now. What we've seen instead is a resort that has been steadily cannibalizing itself for over a decade. Every step forward is met with 2 steps back. Every new announcement is followed by silence. The few projects that do materialize are either insignificant or plagued with complications. There's no clear direction, no sustained investment, no strategy to fix what's broken, just a slow crawl toward irrelevance. More importantly, this downward trajectory isn't isolated to just the resort. The OCT group itself has been facing widespread financial issues, struggling with its broader portfolio of parks and developments across China. They've lost 26 billion won in the last 3 years. In accordance with this, OCT has scaled back projects, missed revenue expectations, and faced growing competition from better-run operators like Chimelong, Wanda, and international players like Universal and Disney. If they can't stabilize their core assets, there's little chance they'll be able to pour the kind of money into a dying mountain resort that it would take to even attempt a full revival. At this point, hoping for a dramatic turnaround is less about strategy and more about wishful thinking. And if there's one lesson to take from the entire OCT East saga, it's that relying on fantasy instead of facing hard truths is exactly how they ended up here in the first place. The dream that was OCT East Resort, the dream of a massive mountainous tourist city, turned into a nightmare over the years, a nightmare to manage, operate, and even draw guests to. With amusement projects popping up all over China at the same time, many also operated by the OCT group, OCT East simply got lost in the mix. For it to have been a Disney-esque success, so many things would have had to go right from the get-go. But the resort's scale, lack of access, and failures early led it down a path that was almost impossible to stray from. From day one, the resort was fighting problems without much success at all. To be honest, it's amazing the place has survived as long as it has, even considering the shape it's in. As for how the resort is today, a scenic spot in a lush mountainous jungle doesn't sound all that bad. In order for it to sustain itself, though, OCT would have to downscale drastically. They'd have to completely cut off all parts of the resort that don't align with that vision just to stay afloat financially, and then hope that the resort's new identity draws in enough guests. But to be honest, I don't see that happening. In my eyes, this place will be completely abandoned in 5 or 10 years' time. Which begs the question of what OCT East's failure means to the rest of the world. Today, there seem to be many theme park projects under development in a similar style to OCT East, both in China and in other places around the world like the Middle East. A major example of this is Six Flags Qiddiya. Qiddiya bears many similarities to OCT East. They're both enormous theme park megaprojects located in isolated places outside of major developing cities, with a multitude of different focuses and at least partially funded by the government. I do believe Qiddiya has a greater chance of being successful than OCT East did, but the state of that park a few years down the line has more to do with the promises they keep than the promises they make. These theme park megaprojects are huge investments that have either a chance to be extremely successful or crash and burn, and it only takes 1 or 2 things going wrong before you end up with another OCT East, a resort built with promise, but one that failed drastically. In regards to OCT East, I'll leave you with this, a report from an anonymous visitor. The once bustling tourist attraction is no longer the scenery, its charm and popularity seem to fade with time. Visitors will find that many facilities that should provide entertainment and leisure experiences are no longer available, forgotten in corners, and their presence is only reminiscent of past glory. The whole attraction presents a dilapidated scene, with rust and worn facilities everywhere, making people feel a bleak beauty. These rusts not only covered the amusement equipment, but also spread to the surrounding environment, as if the traces of time left here, reminding people that the busyness here and the current depression have formed a stark contrast. Even during the holidays, there are few tourists here, which is very different from the scenes of the past. This deserted atmosphere makes the whole attraction more empty and silent, as if there is a sense of loneliness in the air. The price is extremely low for visitors looking for a relaxing stay here. They may be disappointed that the service and experience they can enjoy after paying for the ticket cost is far from what they expected. The aging and poor maintenance of the facilities and the sharp decline in the number of tourists have greatly reduced the attraction of this attraction and is no longer a recommended place. Overall, the status quo of this attraction is regrettable, and it needs a lot of investment and renovation to restore the past glory and re-attract the eyes of tourists. However, in the current situation, it can only serve as a living example of the rise and fall of tourism. OCT East's story is a tragic one, a case study in what goes wrong when reach exceeds grasp. Designed to be a mythical mountain city, the resort devolved into the shell of what it once aspired to be. The dream that was OCT East eroded much like the structures themselves did, because it aimed too high and delivered far too little. Most of the resort's problems weren't rooted in the park itself, but in how it was run, without care, without a willingness to improve, and worst of all, without respect for the guests. In the end, OCT East didn't fail because of one single mistake. It didn't fail because of poor location, or because of a tragic accident, or even because of a global pandemic. It failed because the people behind it never truly cared about the guest experience. That was the thread that ran through every issue: the ridiculous scale without the solid foundation, the half-baked attractions, the decaying facilities left to rot, and the absent customer service. At every turn, the guest was an afterthought. The truth is that this resort was built with the ambition to impress, not to please. It was engineered to look good on paper rather than to feel good in person. And when things started to fall apart, OCT East didn't respond by listening to its visitors or reinvesting in their experience. It responded by retreating, cutting corners, shutting down what didn't immediately turn a profit, until the entire thing was a shell of what it was supposed to be. Every hardship that this resort faced outside of the pandemic was something that could have been prevented with proper planning. Space Journey wouldn't have crashed if people would have cared enough to fix the faulty system once it was in place. The resort would have been more accessible if it had installed a bus line from Shenzhen to get there, like a lot of Chinese parks were doing at the time. And the resort as a whole would have functioned better if it had opened small and expanded later. The idea could have worked, in fact it likely would have. But both management and park operators seem to hold the idea that the scale of the resort was more important than the people it was made for. And that's what truly killed this place. Some people might point to its underwhelming opening, its competition, or most likely the Space Journey accident as the cause of OCT East's death, but the real culprit was something completely controllable. Looking through thousands of reviews, only one theme appeared more consistently than attraction closures: complaints regarding park policies, management, and staff. More than any broken ride or overgrown building, it was the sheer neglect for guest happiness that destroyed OCT East Resort. Because when you forget about your guests, eventually they forget about you. And when that happens, you're left abandoned in the mountains of Shenzhen, your legacy fading, your purpose lost, and your gates left open to no one. Since you've made it to the very end of the video, I'd like to thank you for watching. I'd also like to thank Freddie, my collaborative partner on this one, for everything he did to help on this video. It would not be possible without him. As you can probably tell, this video took a ton of time to make. There were a lot of delays, but this video has essentially been in the making for over 2 years. And I haven't uploaded in over half a year, so this is the reason why. So if you did enjoy it, go ahead and leave a like, maybe subscribe, I don't know. Something I do really want to add is that since finishing the script, some new developments are being made at OCT East, and if you've been following the park as of late, you probably know what I'm talking about. It's undergoing pretty substantial renovations. Night Valley got closed down completely a couple months ago for a revitalization effort, so it looks like OCT is still trying to keep this resort going. Still, I don't think it changes the overall message of what we said in the video. This might be the biggest refurbishment the resort has had in quite a while, but there is still an unbelievably long way to go if the OCT group hopes that OCT East will become one of China's premier resorts. Also, like I mentioned in the video, efforts have been made in the past to revamp this place, none of which have been all that successful. That being said, I encourage you to follow what's going on with this resort right now as well as in the future, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions at all. Once again, thank you so much for your support. Have a great day.